From what I have said, 'tis plain that according to the doctrine delivered in our first confession of faith, two things are requisite in order to the right administration of the sacraments according to the divine institution. First, that they be ministered by lawful ministers, and one of the characters given us of lawful ministers is their being lawfully chosen to the ministry by some church. The second requisite is that they be ministered in such elements and in such sort as God hath appointed. Hence I justly conclude that such as are intruded upon the church, or imposed upon Christian congregations without their call and consent, as they run unto the work of the Lord unsent, so they are not lawful ministers of Christ, and consequently that the administration of gospel ordinances by such intruders wants that purity and rectitude which the divine institution requires. Our author in his short vindication, page 6, proposes the following question, quote, "Such men as going to the plantations are ordained, could they not rightly administer the sacraments, though as yet they have not been chosen by any particular church?" Unquote. To which I answer, if they are not chosen by any particular church, yet neither are such men intruded upon any particular church, and this does very much alter the case. But further, extraordinary cases, such as the above case supposed, fall not under the present question. Our author knew some time ago how to distinguish betwixt ordinary and extraordinary cases, for he tells us in his Jus Pop Div, page 162, quote, that such is the people's interest in election of their pastors, that their bare election is enough to make one a minister of Christ, where ordination cannot be had according to his institution, unquote. Yet he very well knows that according to the sentiments of Presbyterian divines, the bare election of the people in ordinary cases will not constitute one a lawful minister of Christ without ordination. In like manner, though in some extraordinary cases, indefinite ordination, as they term it, may be necessary and sufficient to denominate one a lawful minister of Christ, yet in ordinary cases, when one is appointed a minister unto a particular congregation, ordination without lawful election does not constitute him a lawful minister of Christ. And if it is true, as Mr. Currie affirms in his preface to the foresaid book, page 4, quote, "It is an impious robbing of the church, rapine and sacrilege to settle any minister, whether the people call and consent or not," unquote. How can the church be obliged to receive and acknowledge such as her lawful pastors who are impious robbers and who are guilty of rapine and sacrilege? Upon the whole, it is evident that the present question is not about the validity of the sacraments dispensed by intruders, but whether or not such should be held in repute as lawful and sent ministers of Christ, who have not been chosen by any church whatsoever, but who are imposed upon the church while dissenting and reclaiming. And if such are not to be held in repute as lawful and sent ministers of Christ, whether or not the administration of gospel ordinances by such has that purity and rectitude which the divine institution requires. And I humbly judge that the above cited article of our first confession of faith decides both of the questions in the manner I have already observed in my postscript. And therefore, when men are intruded upon the church by the present judicatories, and also countenanced and supported by them in their ministerial administrations, our author might have spared, or at least he ought to have qualified his confident boast. Essay page 3, quote, "I think none can object against this, that the seals of God's covenant are as purely administered in his church as ever they were in any," unquote. Our author, in his short vindication, page 6, puts another question unto me, which I shall not decline to answer. Quote, "Will our brother," says he, "deny that the sacraments could be rightly administered by the great Mr. Henderson when in Lucars, albeit he was thrust in upon them at first?" Unquote. To which I answer, there's a vast difference betwixt Luther, a poor blind friar, as he speaks concerning himself, and the same Luther when enlightened in the knowledge of the truth. In the former case, he was neither a lawyer nor sent minister of Christ according to our confession. Yet, for the reasons I have given, the sacraments dispensed by him were valid. In like manner, there was a great difference betwixt Mr. Henderson, the prelatic incumbent and intruder in the parish of Lucars, and the same Mr. Henderson when converted by the ministry of the famous Mr. Robert Bruce. In the former case, according to our said confession, he was not a lawful minister of Christ, yet for the same reasons the sacraments dispensed by him were valid. The essay observes, page 3, from the fulfilling of the Scriptures, that Mr. Henderson, having gone out of curiosity to hear Mr. Bruce preach, the words he first uttered from the pulpit were, "He that cometh not in by the door, but climbeth up any other way, the same is a thief and a robber." These words were very close to the case of Mr. Henderson the intruder, and the essay tells us, quote, "did by the Lord's blessing, at the very present, take him by the heart, and had so great an impression on him, that they were the mean of his conversion," unquote. If the present intruders in the Church of Scotland would give the same evidences of their sincere repentance and conversion which the great Mr. Henderson gave, I doubt not but all the Lord's people through the land would cheerfully embrace them as lawful ministers of Christ, and if the present judicatories of the Church would give the like evidences of their repentance for the violation they have done to the heritage of God, and their other steps of defection from our Reformation principles, our secession from them would soon be at an end. But it is to be regretted that the quite contrary practices pursued. The judicatories justify themselves in their sinful proceedings, and intruders hold themselves as lawful and sent ministers of Christ. The Lord may justly say of us, as he speaks of Judah by the prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 8, verse 6, "I hearkened and heard, but they spake not aright. No man repented him of his wickedness, saying, What have I done?" I have not declined to make answer to such questions as the author of the essay in his short vindication has thought fit to propose upon this head unto me, and therefore I may expect that he will not refuse to give me an answer to the two following. The first is, whether or not such as are intruded into the office of the ministry, or who are appointed ministers over dissenting and reclaiming congregations, should be received and acknowledged by the Church as lawful and sent ministers of Christ, while they justify their intrusions and give no evidence of sincere repentance of the same. The second question that I propose is whether or not gospel ordinances dispensed by such are neither lawful nor sent ministers of Christ have the rectitude or purity as their administration which the divine institution requires. As I have given my judgment plainly upon both these questions, and I hope according to the genuine sense and meaning of the above-cited articles of our Confession of Faith, so I wish our author would give a plain and direct answer unto them, without amusing his reader with Dodwell's wild doctrine and an extraneous question about the validity of baptism. I shall conclude this section with a citation from a judicious divine, for whom our author professeth a very great regard, and which I think very applicable to the case now before us, that is, Mr. Durham on the Revelation. In his digression upon reading and hearing, quote, "In matter of hearing," says he, "it is not so hard to discern who are to be accounted to speak without God's commission, because ordinarily such have either no warrantable call at all, no, not in the outward form, and so cannot be accounted but to run unsent, or, by palpable defection from the truth and commission given them in that call, they have forfeited their commission, and so no more are to be accounted ambassadors to Christ or watchmen of his flock than a watchman of the city is to be accounted an observer thereof when he has publicly made defection to the enemy and taken on with them." Unquote. Section 4. Wherein it is shown that by some acts and deeds of the present judicatories, sinful and unwarrantable terms of communion are imposed upon the members of this church. The author of the essay grants, page 36, that when the least sinful term of communion is imposed upon church members, it is a just ground of separation from that church. And the Associate Presbytery, having affirmed in their act and testimony that by some standing acts and deeds of this national church, as she is represented in her present judicators, several unwarrantable terms of communion are imposed upon ministers and other members of the church. Though I judge that I have evinced in the preceding sections that the present judicatories and their management with respect to the doctrine, government, and discipline have broken the bonds of our ecclesiastical unity, as also that they have forfeit their claim to the characters given us in the 18th article of our confession of a true church, that is, of a church which has attained such a measure of purity that we may safely join ourselves unto her as members of the same ecclesiastic body, and though, from what is already observed, it may clearly appear that secession from the present judicatories is lawful and warrantable, yet I shall briefly notice what these sinful and unwarrantable terms of communion are, which the Presbytery affirm are imposed upon the members of this church, and I shall also consider what the author of the essay has advanced to take off the force of the argument for secession, as it is stated upon sinful terms of communion. The Associate Presbytery in their Judicial Act and Testimony, page 85, observe that the Act of the Assembly 1733 against Mr. Erskine and the other protesting ministers, two sinful terms of communion were imposed. First, quote, that no minister of this church should testify from the pulpit against acts of assembly and proceedings of church judicatories, even though they were such as had direct tendency to undermine our Constitution. And secondly, that no minister or member of this church should protest for their own exoneration against acts, sentences, or doctrines of the Supreme Judicatory, even though they should nearly affect the public cause of God and restrain ministerial freedom and faithfulness in testifying against the sins and defections of a backsliding church, unquote. The Presbytery do justly conclude that the sentence of rebuke and admonition put against Mr. Erskine on account of his doctrinal freedom in testifying against the sinful proceedings of the judicatories was an act and deed of the Supreme Judicatory, making all the ministers of this church liable to censure, if they should testify doctrinally against the same or the like proceedings of the judicatories. As also they judge, 'tis plain that the severe sentence passed against the four protesting ministers on account of their protestation was an act and deed of the Supreme Judicatory, finding and declaring any minister or member of this church obnoxious to censure, if they should protest for their own exoneration against sinful acts, sentences, or decisions of the Supreme Judicatory restraining ministerial freedom and faithfulness. The Presbytery likewise judge that by the act and sentence of the Assembly 1733, discharging the ministers of the Presbytery of Dunfermline under pain of the highest censure, to admit any of the parish of Kinross to sealing ordinances without permission of the intruded incumbent. Two other unwarrantable terms of communion are imposed. The first, whereof is that by the foresaid act, ministers are bound up from dispensing or sealing ordinances to such of the Lord's people as have not freedom to submit to the ministry of intruders under pain of the highest censure. And secondly, by the very same act, all the Lord's people through the land are required to submit to intruders as their lawful pastors, or otherwise they are excommunicated from sealing ordinances. The plain import and meaning of the foresaid act is that people must either submit to the ministry of intruded incumbents or want the sealing ordinances of the gospel, and if any minister shall venture to dispense them unto them, except in the above terms prescribed in the act, that is, the permission of the intruded incumbent, he must do it at his peril. The highest censure of the church are denounced against him. This looks very like the tyrannical anathemas pronounced by the Council of Trent against all the Protestant churches who would not submit to their no less tyrannical decisions. The author of the essay grants, page 36, that it is a sinful term of communion, quote, if a church requires of us to condemn anything in our former practice which is just and lawful, unquote. And also, quote, if they require us to condemn anything in the practice of others which is right and equitable, unquote. And he cannot refuse that submission to a sentence of rebuke for the discharge of one's duty and the retracting of a protestation for exoneration which was demanded of Mr. Erskine and the other protesting ministers was a requiring them to condemn a thing in their own practice which they judged upon good grounds to be just and lawful. Neither can it be reasonably refuted that when ministers are convinced in their own minds that it is the duty of the people to withdraw from intruded incumbents, if notwithstanding of this they are discharged, under the pain of the highest censures of the church, to dispense sealing ordinances to people who live under and the ministry of such, then they are expressly required to condemn a thing in the practice of others, which they judge right and equitable. Yea, further, if people are by an ecclesiastical act and sentence shut up under the ministry of intruders, they are thereby obliged, yea, they are forced as far as an ecclesiastic canon can do it, to own and acknowledge such for their unlawful and sent ministers as they are persuaded have run unsent.